The red and blue lights hit your rearview mirror so fast, you barely have time to process what just happened. Your stomach tightens. Your hands instinctively move to the steering wheel. You look down at your speedometer even though it's already too late. Then the officer steps out of the patrol car slowly, one hand resting near the belt, scanning your vehicle before even reaching your window. And right there, before a single word is spoken, the entire traffic stop has already started psychologically. Have you ever been pulled over or questioned by police and later realized you accidentally made the situation worse without even knowing it at the time? Tell me your experience in the comments, because a lot of drivers think they handled a stop correctly until they learn what officers were actually looking for during the interaction. And later in this discussion, I'm going to explain one mistake people make during casual conversation that silently gives officers far more control over the stop than most drivers understand. The first thing people need to understand is that traffic stops are not just about traffic. That's the biggest misconception drivers have. Most people think the stop begins and ends with whatever violation supposedly happened. Speeding, broken tail light, rolling stop, window tint, registration issue. But experienced officers often use the traffic violation as the doorway, not the destination. That changes the entire dynamic. When an officer approaches your car, they're usually evaluating multiple things simultaneously, not just your license and registration. They're watching your hands, your eye movement, your breathing, whether you're over-explaining, whether your passenger interrupts, whether there's conflicting information, whether your voice changes when certain questions are asked. A lot of drivers panic because they think police already know something. Usually they don't. They're observing reactions in real time. And that brings me to the first major tip people need to understand when cops come knocking at your window during a stop. Slow everything down. Not physically, psychologically. One of the fastest ways drivers create problems is by reacting emotionally to the stop itself. You can almost hear the mental spiral happening. Why are they pulling me over? Did I do something? Are they trying to search my car? What if they think I'm nervous? Then the officer reaches the window and asks a simple question. Do you know why I stopped you? That question sounds harmless, casual, almost polite, but it's one of the most strategically important moments of the stop, because people start talking. I'm sorry, officer, I know I was probably speeding a little. I was texting, but I only looked down for a second. I'm late for work. I had a couple beers earlier, but I'm totally fine. Notice what just happened. The driver started building evidence against themselves before the officer even presented evidence first. Officers are trained to let silence work on people. Silence makes nervous drivers fill gaps. Human beings naturally hate awkward silence, especially under authority pressure. So people volunteer information they were never asked to provide. And the crazy part is, many drivers think honesty means full narration. It doesn't. There's a difference between complying with lawful instructions and verbally building a case against yourself. Now, that does not mean you become hostile. Some internet personalities push this fantasy that you should immediately start challenging everything. That usually backfires hard in the real world. Officers are human beings operating in uncertain environments. If your energy instantly becomes confrontational, suspicious, sarcastic, or theatrical, the stop often escalates emotionally even if legally you're within your rights. Tone matters more than people think. A calm voice can protect you better than an aggressive speech about constitutional law shouted through a cracked window. And officers absolutely notice emotional shifts. Here's something many drivers don't realize. Officers often ask repeated questions intentionally. Not because they forgot your answer, they want consistency. Where are you headed tonight? You answer. 3 minutes later, another officer asks the same thing. Then, maybe later, so you said you were coming from your friend's house. People start changing details accidentally because stress affects memory and speech patterns. Officers know this. That's why repeated questioning is such a common tactic during stops involving suspicion of DUI, narcotics, or criminal activity. Now here's where things get dangerous for ordinary people who think they're helping themselves. They start over-explaining. That's one of the biggest mistakes during police encounters. A simple answer turns into a life story because the driver believes extra details make them appear innocent. But investigators are trained to examine inconsistencies inside unnecessary details. Imagine this exchange. Where are you coming from? A restaurant. That's one thing. But nervous people often say, oh, I was at this restaurant with my cousin. Actually, my cousin's friend too, over near downtown. But we left because the line was long, then we went somewhere else, then I stopped for gas. Now the officer has multiple details to compare later if suspicion increases. Most drivers do not realize how often they accidentally expand the scope of a stop themselves. And speaking of scope, let's talk about one of the most misunderstood moments during roadside encounters. The waiting game. You hand over your documents. The officer walks back to the patrol car. Minutes pass. 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes. Now your anxiety starts climbing because uncertainty creates psychological pressure. Drivers begin wondering if they're about to be arrested, searched, or detained longer. And this is where many people make another critical mistake. They start trying to force casual conversation when the officer returns. Everything okay? What's taking so long? Am I in trouble? Again, human nature hates uncertainty. But officers sometimes intentionally allow that uncertainty to sit because nervous behavior often reveals more than direct questioning. The reality is many roadside investigations are built less on dramatic evidence and more on cumulative observations. Tiny indicators stacked together, shaking hands, conflicting timelines, strong odors, visible containers, extreme nervousness disproportionate to the stop, passengers avoiding eye contact, unusual travel explanations, vehicle clutter associated with long-distance transport. That's how routine stops sometimes evolve. And before somebody says, well, everyone gets nervous around police, yes, that's true. Officers know normal nervousness exists. The issue is not nervousness alone, it's clusters of behavior combined with inconsistent communication. This is why composure matters so much. Not fake confidence, real calmness. Because fake confidence often becomes arrogance, and arrogance changes the emotional temperature of the stop fast. Now let's talk about another moment people rarely prepare for mentally. The request to step out of the vehicle. This catches drivers off guard because they interpret it emotionally instead of tactically. An officer says, "Step out of the car for me." Immediately the driver's brain goes, "I'm getting arrested." Not necessarily. Under US law, officers generally can order drivers out during lawful traffic stops for safety reasons. Courts have consistently allowed this. But the psychology behind it matters too. Once you exit the vehicle, officers gain a better observational advantage. They can watch balance, movement, coordination, pocket behavior, eye movement, speech patterns. The vehicle itself also becomes easier to visually inspect from outside angles. That's why your behavior after exiting matters enormously. Some drivers make sudden movements because they're nervous. Bad idea. Some start reaching into pockets without warning. Very bad idea. Others begin emotionally arguing roadside. Even worse. Remember, officers are assessing threat levels constantly. A traffic stop is unpredictable for them too. They don't know who they're walking up to. Every movement gets interpreted through a safety lens first. That doesn't mean every officer acts fairly. Let's be honest about reality. Some officers absolutely escalate situations unnecessarily. Some become aggressive. Some push conversational boundaries, hoping drivers consent to things they legally could refuse. That happens. But emotional reactions from drivers often feed escalation cycles unintentionally. And this is where silence becomes incredibly powerful when used correctly. Notice I said correctly. Silence is not magical immunity, it's strategic restraint. One of the smartest things a driver can do during a tense stop is stop volunteering unnecessary explanations once lawful identification requirements are satisfied. People underestimate how difficult silence is under pressure. An officer asks, "You don't mind if I take a quick look inside the vehicle, right?" Now the driver feels social pressure. Because the wording sounds casual, friendly, informal, almost like refusing would automatically imply guilt. That's intentional psychological framing. Most people are conditioned from childhood to cooperate with authority figures socially, so they say yes reflexively even when they don't want to, and later, they regret it. Here's the reality many viewers need to hear. You can be completely innocent and still create enormous legal complications by consenting to unnecessary searches. Because once officers enter your vehicle, everything changes. Maybe a friend left something illegal in there weeks ago. Maybe there's a prescription bottle issue. Maybe there's cash officers interpret suspiciously. Maybe there's paraphernalia forgotten under a seat. Maybe a passenger dropped something without your knowledge. Suddenly a routine stop becomes something else entirely. And people often say afterward, "I had nothing to hide." That phrase has caused more self-inflicted problems than people realize. Privacy rights are not admissions of guilt. Now let me pause here because there's another side nobody talks about enough. Body language. Drivers obsess over legal phrases online while completely ignoring non-verbal communication. Your tone, posture, speed of movement, eye behavior, and emotional control heavily influence roadside interactions. For example, rapid, frantic movement inside the vehicle before the officer reaches the window immediately raises concern. Officers approaching from behind cannot see clearly into your car initially. If they observe leaning, reaching, digging under seats, or sudden movement, their threat perception spikes instantly. Even innocent behavior can look dangerous. That's why experienced defense attorneys often recommend keeping hands visible and movements slow. Simple actions matter. Turn interior lights on at night. Keep hands where visible. Tell the officer before reaching for documents, "Officer, my registration is in the glove compartment." That communication reduces uncertainty. And uncertainty is what creates tension during stops. Now here's something controversial but true. Many drivers sabotage themselves because their ego takes over. They become obsessed with winning the interaction instead of safely ending it. That mentality is dangerous. A roadside stop is not a courtroom debate. It's not YouTube entertainment. It's not the place to test every legal theory you heard online from someone filming police for clicks. Real-life traffic stops carry real consequences. An officer having a bad night, a nervous rookie officer, miscommunication, sudden movement, or emotional escalation can spiral faster than people imagine. That's why strategic calmness beats performative defiance almost every time. And speaking of escalation, let's talk about passengers. Passengers frequently make situations worse without realizing it. An officer approaches and starts speaking with the driver. Then suddenly the passenger jumps in. "He didn't do anything wrong. Why are you stopping us? You can't search this car." Now tension increases because multiple voices create confusion and unpredictability. Officers often separate occupants conversationally during suspicious stops, precisely because inconsistent stories matter. And here's where people accidentally hurt themselves again. Passengers start trying to help by explaining too much. That usually creates more contradictions, not less. One says they were coming from dinner. Another says they were visiting friends. One says they left an hour ago. Another says 30 minutes. Now officers become more suspicious because conflicting stories are classic investigative indicators. Stress destroys coordination between people. That's why silence and simplicity matter so much during roadside interactions. Now let's get into one of the most uncomfortable realities about police questioning. Friendly officers can still be gathering evidence. A huge mistake drivers make is assuming tone equals intent. An officer smiling does not necessarily mean the interaction is harmless. In fact, experienced investigators often use calm conversational tones because people lower their guard. "You mind if I ask where you guys are headed? Any weapons in the car? You guys been partying tonight?" Sounds casual, right? But every answer contributes to the officer's assessment. People tend to think interrogation only happens under bright lights in interrogation rooms. Not true. Some of the most important admissions happen roadside during supposedly informal conversation, especially when people are nervous and trying to appear cooperative. Now here's another critical thing drivers misunderstand. Officers are trained observers, very trained. They notice tiny changes, a delayed response, a trembling hand, a sudden dry swallow, avoided eye contact after a specific question, an unnatural laugh, overly rehearsed answers. And yes, innocent people can display these behaviors too. But in policing, observations accumulate contextually. That's why emotional regulation matters so much more than memorizing internet scripts. I've seen situations where drivers talk themselves from a warning into a deeper investigation simply because they could not stop talking. The officer originally intended to issue a citation and leave. But the driver became increasingly nervous, argumentative, inconsistent, or overly explanatory. Now suspicion grows. Now additional officers arrive. Now a canine unit enters the conversation. Everything changes. And this leads directly into another important point people rarely think about beforehand. Time distortion during stops. 5 minutes can feel like 30 when adrenaline kicks in. Drivers begin mentally catastrophizing. Why is backup here? Why are they stalling? Why is the second officer looking through the back window? Stress amplifies imagination. Meanwhile, officers may simply be following procedure, checking records, waiting on dispatch, or observing behavior. That uncertainty creates psychological pressure designed partly by circumstance and partly by investigative technique. And under pressure, people make mistakes. Big ones. Some drivers suddenly attempt humor. Terrible timing. Jokes about weapons, drugs, warrants, or alcohol can instantly escalate seriousness. Even obvious sarcasm creates unnecessary risk because officers cannot safely assume intent during uncertain encounters. Others become verbally combative because they interpret basic questioning as personal disrespect. Again, bad move. You can assert rights calmly without emotionally challenging officers. That distinction matters tremendously. Now let's discuss one tactic many people don't recognize when it's happening: the conversational loop. An officer asks a question, you answer. Then later they revisit the same topic from a slightly different angle. Not accidental. Investigators often test consistency gradually rather than aggressively. For example, where are you headed? Later, how long until you get there? Then, so your friend lives over there? The officer may already know whether details line up geographically or logically. People under stress forget prior answers constantly, and once contradictions appear, officers frequently interpret them as deception indicators. This is one reason attorneys consistently warn clients against excessive roadside conversation, because most people are not skilled communicators under pressure. Now there's another issue nobody likes discussing honestly. People think innocence guarantees safety. It doesn't. Innocent people get arrested sometimes. Innocent people make poor statements sometimes. Innocent people consent to searches they later regret. Innocent people accidentally obstruct investigations through panic and confusion. That's reality. And that's exactly why understanding roadside dynamics matters before the lights ever appear behind you. Preparation changes behavior. People who have mentally rehearsed calmness typically perform far better during stressful encounters, not because they beat police, because they avoid making emotional mistakes. Now I want to talk about document handling because this creates more tension than people expect. You hand over your license and registration. Minutes later, the officer still has them. Some drivers panic internally because retaining documents can make them feel trapped psychologically. And honestly, in many situations, you are not free to leave during an active traffic stop. But here's where drivers create problems. They begin physically shifting around impatiently, checking phones repeatedly, trying to exit the vehicle without instruction, calling people emotionally, arguing loudly with passengers. Every one of those behaviors changes the atmosphere. Officers returning to a visibly agitated vehicle become more cautious automatically. Again, perception drives behavior during stops. Now let's discuss one myth that spreads constantly online. If you refuse every question, police can't do anything. That is dangerously oversimplified. Refusing voluntary questioning may protect you legally in some situations, but delivery matters enormously. There's a difference between calmly declining to answer and behaving confrontationally. For example, I prefer not to answer questions, officer. Very different from, I know my rights, you can't ask me that. One sounds controlled, the other sounds emotionally escalatory. And emotional escalation changes officer behavior, whether people like it or not. Remember, roadside encounters involve psychology as much as law. Now here's something subtle but extremely important. Officers often mirror energy. A calm driver frequently receives calmer communication. An agitated driver often receives firmer control. Not always, but often. And yes, unfair stops happen, absolutely. But your behavior still influences outcomes dramatically, especially in ambiguous situations where officers are deciding whether suspicion justifies prolonging the encounter. Now let's talk about inspection tactics because many viewers have experienced strange behavior during stops without understanding what was happening. An officer shines a flashlight repeatedly into the back seat. They linger near one side of the vehicle. They ask passengers odd questions separately. They casually mention smell. They pause after certain answers. These are not random behaviors. Officers are gathering sensory information continuously. Visual cues, odors, behavioral responses, contradictions. And one thing many people fail to understand is that officers do not need certainty to investigate further. They need articulable suspicion. That threshold matters. Tiny details can contribute collectively, which is exactly why drivers should avoid creating unnecessary details themselves. Now here's a moment where people often destroy their own credibility. The officer catches a small lie, not even a major one. Maybe the driver says they had nothing to drink. but there's a faint odor of alcohol. Maybe they deny recent marijuana use despite obvious smell. Maybe travel details don't make sense geographically. Once credibility weakens, everything afterward becomes harder. Officers begin viewing all statements skeptically. That's why experienced attorneys often say partial truths and unnecessary denials create more damage than careful silence. And there's another psychological trap drivers fall into: trying too hard to appear innocent, over-smiling, over-talking, over-explaining, forced friendliness. People think they're reducing suspicion, but exaggerated behavior can actually increase it because authenticity disappears. Calm neutrality usually works better. Now I want to touch on something uncomfortable but real. Fear changes memory. After stressful stops, people often misremember timelines, wording, and behavior. That's why emotions during encounters can distort perception later. An officer may remember the driver as aggressive. The driver remembers themselves as assertive. A passenger remembers confusion. Stress alters interpretation for everyone involved. That's one reason recording interactions, where legally permitted, has become so common. Memory alone is unreliable under adrenaline. But even there, some people make another mistake. They perform for the camera. That usually hurts more than helps. Once people start treating stops like public theater, emotional escalation increases dramatically. And officers notice that shift immediately. Now here's something many viewers need to hear carefully. You do not have to prove innocence roadside. That mindset traps people. Drivers think if they just explain enough, the officer will completely understand everything. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. But over-explaining under stress often creates inconsistencies, admissions, or confusion that become far more important later than the original stop itself. And this brings me to one of the biggest myths in American traffic stop culture. The idea that confidence alone controls outcomes. It doesn't. Preparation does. Understanding does. Emotional discipline does. Because when those lights activate behind you, your brain immediately enters a stress environment whether you realize it or not. Heart rate increases, fine motor skills decrease, speech patterns change, decision-making narrows. That's why mentally rehearsing calm responses matters beforehand. Not because you expect trouble every stop, because human beings perform better under pressure when they already understand the environment. Now think about how many roadside encounters spiral from tiny emotional moments. A driver takes offense at a question. An officer interprets irritation as suspiciousness. The driver becomes defensive. The officer becomes firmer. Backup arrives. Passengers get nervous. Voices rise slightly. Suddenly a routine encounter feels dangerous for everyone involved. And afterward both sides insist the other escalated first. That's how quickly roadside psychology can shift. So when cops come knocking at your window, understand something most people never fully grasp. The stop is not only about law, it's about perception, timing, emotion, communication, uncertainty, and pressure. The officer is studying you while you're trying to study the officer. Every movement means something to somebody. Every unnecessary sentence creates possibility. Every emotional reaction shifts the atmosphere. That doesn't mean surrender your rights. It means use them intelligently. Because the people who usually navigate traffic stops best are not the loudest, most aggressive, or most theatrical. They're the ones who stay mentally composed while everyone else lets stress take control. And the strange part is, most drivers won't realize how much pressure affects their judgment until they hear those words through the half-open window one night. "Sir, I just need you to step out of the vehicle for me."